Another weekend of just little bits and pieces. I'm in my little lab. I'm just about to laser cut a template for a manifold gasket. This is because I also need to cut out the mounting brackets for the rear shock absorbers, and I can get those plasma cut. It's an engineering firm up the road. If I send them the files, they can cut it out of steel for me. So I thought, while I'm doing that, I might as well get some exhaust manifold plates made out of mild steel so I can look at how I'm going to build the exhaust when the time comes. I've also been playing with the 3D printer. I've actually built a model of the chassis in CAD software that I've been trying to print out, and anyone who's done any 3D printing will know it's a very fiddly process, or it can be. I got halfway through this print and then the motors skipped and it all went wonky, but this is a start. This is 1/12 scale. The other thing I've been doing is I made a bigger plating tank. So this is working quite well, and there's a nut in there that I'm plating at the moment. You can see in the bottom of the tank lots of leftover nickel strip. It doesn't seem to harm it, I just leave it in there. I figure if there's any nickel metal in there, the ions will be coming out into the solution, which is what you want anyway. I ended up repairing my power supply. This power supply there's a couple of chips in it that drive the displays, one to show voltage and one to show current. And I'd ended up zapping one of them with static electricity with my Van de Graaff machine. I was using the power supply to power that. And turns out it's a relatively straightforward IC to get, and I managed to get a couple from China for a couple of dollars. Chances are they've been pulled out of some old equipment, but it didn't really matter. It's done the trick, it's working. So with this power supply, I can adjust the voltage to adjust the current. And I've been finding about 200 to 250 milliamps seems to be a good amount of current for little bits and pieces like nuts and bolts and things. But I was just about to start this laser cutting, so let's see. I'll put my laser safety goggles on just in case, and I'll also turn on my ventilation. So that'll sit there and cut out the template. With the paper template, I can just check that I've got all the dimensions correct, and if not, I can remodel it, vary the dimensions in the model, and I'll do the same for the rear shock mounts. It's a bit tricky to see, but you can see that's managed to cut that out. I think I actually have this set for 2 passes, but should be enough. So I'll leave that going for a bit. This chassis model takes something like 5-6 hours to print, possibly longer, because I think I'll slow it down just to avoid the danger of the motors skipping. I have successfully printed one, but I'm playing around with the quality, trying to get better quality out of it. The problem with printing something like this is it's not flat on the bottom. So you have to use what's called support for the pieces that are effectively hanging up in the air. And when you break the support off the bottom, it leaves a very rough, horrible surface. So that's going to take quite a bit of cleaning up. So I'm trying to figure out how to minimize that. For my 3D printed Enigma machine, I managed to design the entire machine so it doesn't need any support, which means you don't have to clean up the plastic. This plastic, you can sand it. You can't really use machines to sand it because it'll get too hot and it'll melt the plastic. So it's going to take some hand finishing. I'll leave this to cut, and I'll also cut out the rear shock bracket to see if I've got that correct and go from there. Back in Big Shed now. A few of the other little bits and pieces I've been working on. The cams, I had to very slightly machine down the face of one of the bushes just to get the right sort of end float in here. I'm not sure exactly what it's supposed to be. I asked on the forum and nobody had an exact figure, but some seems to be the answer. So I think I've got 4 thou in each of those now, which should be fine. It's not really a problem because the thrust on these, because of the way the gears are cut, it's pushing against it. So the thrust's taken up on that bearing, which is why it's there. What else have I done? These, I can't refit the gears at the moment. These are the keys that were in there. They're obviously homemade. They're a little bit shonky. Luckily, a friend of mine has some that he's going to send me, and I'll make those fit. I can reuse these lock washers as long as I won't bend up the tab that's been previously bent up. I just flatten those out and sandblasted them to get them clean. That's what locks these nuts in place. I haven't done anything else on assembling the engine. That's still sitting here under its dust cover because of the circlips that I'm missing to fit the gudgeon pins. So I'm missing 2 of these. I've looked everywhere. I don't know where I put them. And you'd think you could just go out and buy new British standard 9/16, which is what I think these are, circlips. But apparently not. Nobody in New Zealand stocks them. I rang one of the big suppliers and they told me to try a smaller place. And they said, yeah, they've got some, they'll send them out. It cost me, I think, $20, including the rural delivery for 10 of them. And they're the wrong size. They're completely the wrong size. So you can sort of see those aren't the same. And the thickness is different. And I think the thickness is critical because that has to fit into the little groove inside the piston. A lot of places will say they've got 9/16, but what they actually mean is 14 millimeter. And it seems that the Imperial ones are thicker. So they're a millimeter thick, whereas these are 35 thou, so just under a millimeter. And I don't want to risk putting the wrong thing in my pistons and risk having one come loose, and you know, that would be a massive disaster because it'll score the inside of the bores and goodness knows what would happen. So luckily my friend with the Woodruff keys also has a large stock, new old stock that he bought up from an engineering place when it closed down, I guess. And he's got some which he's going to send me as well, which is really, really nice. I really appreciate that. I could get them from the UK, of course, but postage at the best of times is really slow. And around Christmas time, it would take a month or 2 probably to get them. So if I have to do that, I will. But hopefully the ones that are coming will fit and I can get the pistons installed finally. So I need to change the label on that bag because that's not what they are at all. The Rotax panel, I've been playing with that a bit. I sort of made up out of just scraps of steel a little knob thing. It's not the neatest, I must admit. I probably should have spent more time filing it and getting the shape exactly right, but it's close enough. I nickel plated it. There's a modern switch on the back there, but that'll do the job for now. And I've got the starter switch mounted. I need to make the button. I got modern banana sockets. They're just little 4mm standard electrical sockets which look okay, and I'll 3D print the fuse holder. Speaking of 3D printing, this was the first model of the chassis I did. Well, actually the second one. The first one I got the settings wrong, and it came out okay, but you can see how it's quite rough on the bottom there. It would need a lot of cleanup. So I'm playing with it at the moment to see if I can get a better finish on it. But you can see that that's reasonably good. Obviously at this sort of scale you have to cheat a little bit, so I made the chassis rails solid, and I had to make the dimensions here fatter, because otherwise at 1/12 scale, you know, a 1/8 thick steel chassis member or cross member isn't going to be very thick at that scale, so you cheat and you beef things up. But that's just something to play with. Really, it's just a distraction. Now I've got the chassis modeled. Obviously what I can do is start modeling up the body. That's really why I was doing it. 3D printing is a very slow process though, so I can start a print going and leave it all day while I go off and do other things. So that's the cams. This was the little template I laser cut from paper a few minutes ago, just to check that that does match up the ports. I could cut these longer, but I think it'll be better to keep it shorter, so that when I weld in the pipes, whatever I do, coming out of here, I think if this is shorter, it's going to be less likely to distort. I've got a feeling if I left this long here, when you weld that up, what will happen is that end will curve up a little bit from the heat. And I suspect that'll be less likely to happen if it's shorter. Or if it does happen, the curve will be less, which means I can face off the other side of it to get it flat again. That's my thinking. I'll see how it goes. That'll just be mild steel. I don't think that'll be very expensive to get done once I send them the files. And this is the template for the bracket for the suspension mounts on the rear, or 1/2 of the suspension mounts. So the way this works is that bolts onto the trunnion there. Unfortunately, I don't have 1/2-inch bolts, which is what it is, 1/2-inch BSF. But you can see how that goes through there, and then one of these pins bolts onto it like that. So this pin will effectively be up here, and then the shock mounts onto that pin and onto the body. So I will have to make the pins that go down here and another one of those sort of tapered spaces to go on there, the same as I did for the front spring mounts. But that shouldn't be a problem. I've got high tensile steel. I can turn up. This is obviously the right shape for the bushes in the shocks, but I can replicate this now that I've got one. And I suspect what I will do is exactly the same as I did on the front, where the strength is actually the fact that the pin is bolted all the way through and done up tight either side of the chassis rail, with the little spaces in there to take up the gap, but they're not really part of the strength. They're effectively washers that are taking up that gap. So all of that done in high tensile steel should easily be strong enough for the shocks. What I did discover is my holes there are fractionally small. You can see they're slightly oval. That's my laser cutter. I think I've got them at 12 millimeters. They need to be 12.5 for the bolts, obviously. But what I can do is, after it's laser cut, you can never quite guarantee the plasma cut holes are going to be perfect. So it's a good idea to drill those out anyway. So I'll leave them slightly undersized. So that's the Riley at the moment. I did have some news about the Austin 7. So you'll remember I've been waiting months to find out if I can get a VIN for this to start getting it back into the system. The NZTA have come back and said, no, I can't get it through like that. I have to go the low volume certification route. What they have said though, which is helpful, is they class the car as a scratch-built historic replica. Now this all gets really important, the terminology that gets used and what they identify the car as. So when you scratch build a car in New Zealand, there's a constructor's manual that you have to follow. to get the car on the road. And that constructor's manual lists all the rules, all the specifications, all the sort of safety equipment, all sorts of stuff that you need to follow to get the car road legal. Unfortunately, it's really designed around hot rods or modifying cars or much more modern cars. It doesn't really work for vintage cars. Now, they did realize this quite some time ago, and there are special exemptions that can be had for vintage cars. If you go through the manual, you'll find things like the braking system, for example. If it's a modern car, it has to have dual circuit hydraulic brakes. Obviously, that doesn't work on a vintage car that was originally designed for cable brakes. I know people do convert them for Austin 7s, but certainly not dual circuit as far as I know. Things like the lamps that you use have to be lights and lamps that have recognized standard marks on them. So you wouldn't be allowed to use original lamps or reproduction lamps. But there are exemptions for that. The tricky thing is those exemptions seem to come down to their judgment. The Austin 7 will be a little bit trickier. The Riley shouldn't be too bad because it is an exact replica of a Brooklands, or as close as I can make it. The Austin 7 gets a little bit trickier because that's not a body that's a copy, an exact copy of anything. Now, luckily, if you read through the documentation, it does explicitly list an Austin 7 saloon or period Austin 7 with a period sports body as being a historic replica. So given that it's in their own rules and that's written down, there should be a way to do it. The thing is, you need to find a low volume certifier who will help you get through that process, and that's what I'm trying to do at the moment. There aren't very many of them around who can do an entire scratch built car. I think there are even less of them who can do a vintage car or even want to do a vintage car, but hopefully I can find someone who has some knowledge of them and will be able to help get it through that process. But it's going to be interesting. The organisation there say they're there to help. They have been helpful every time I've spoken to them. They've been able to explain things, but they can't really tell until they look at the car. And that's the thing that kind of worries me a little bit is they say they want you to talk to them right from the start, which obviously that's a bit late for me. The Riley is probably at a good stage now, almost being a complete rolling chassis, where they can look at it and see what I'm doing. There's nothing you need to strip off it to understand how it works. It's all completely visible. Nothing needs to be taken apart. If they think there's a way we can get it through, I can go ahead and start building the body. But that's the thing. If it's going to be difficult and you're not sure you're actually going to be able to get it through, you start thinking, well, is it worth me spending, for me, what's going to be probably literally thousands of hours building a frame, building a body for the thing, if you can never drive it on the road? And they can't really guarantee that you ever will be able to. So I kind of have to weigh up what I'm going to do with it. I think for the Riley, it's worth it. There's value in this car. So I don't know. It's, a car that'll be worth money when it's done. An Austin 7, not so much. They're nice little cars, but they're relatively cheap. A special like this, even a nice special, you're not going to sell for that much money. I doubt you would be able to sell it overseas because the amount you'd pay to ship it anywhere is, a large fraction of the value of the car. So would it be worth it? I don't know. So it's going to be interesting. The exemptions that they mention, there is a minimal set that you have to follow. And let's see, from memory, it is the glass. Any glass has to be standard certified. I don't think that's really too much of a problem, especially when I don't have any windscreen. And as far as I can tell, you can quite legally have no windscreen. The brakes have to be up to spec, and I believe I've had a quick look through, and I think the spec is from 30 kilometers an hour, you have to stop within 7 meters, which even this Austin 7 can do that easily, I believe. How you know that without being able to drive the car, I don't know. I guess supposedly you'd have to take it somewhere, some private car park, not on the road, to be able to test that. I'll have to see if I can get up to speed on my driveway or not. The other one is the lighting has to be up to spec. There's basic rules around that. I think the main rule is that the headlights have to be visible 50 meters away. I'll have to look that one up. But the good thing is you don't have to use standard lamps. So the reproduction or the original lamps will be fine. And the only one that's going to be very tricky, I think, is it has to have lap belts. So that I'm not sure about, and that's where I need to get some advice from the certifiers about how exactly you manage that. The Riley isn't so bad. That's not going to be difficult to do. You can see there's a substantial cross member right at the back of the seat. And I'm sure there's a way you can get lap belts into there without too much difficulty. But the Austin 7, I really don't know, because there isn't a heck of a lot to it. I don't know what you could safely attach them to. There's no cross members under there. The floor isn't particularly substantial. The frame on these isn't particularly substantial. I don't know if people fit belts to Austin 7 ulsters or what they do there. So goodness knows how you're supposed to do that. And of course with an Austin 7, as soon as you start trying to weld things onto the chassis, you're going to be changing the design of the car effectively. So I don't know exactly how that's going to work. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with that. I do know there are quite a few people with Austin 7s at the moment being built that are having other issues getting things through. And it really does depend where you go to and who you talk to, and everyone gets told a different story and a different way of doing it. But there must be ways. So there is a quite well-known Riley Special built in New Zealand. Very, very nice car. I think it was re-registered about 10 years ago, and the rules haven't changed that much in that time. And that's effectively a modified Riley saloon car chassis to be like a Brooklyn's, so it's underslung at the rear, but it's got a Tiger Moth engine in it. And Riley cable brakes modified with some sort of Bugatti compensation system. Obviously not a historic replica, if anything, because there's no car like that ever been built before, but you would think if something like that can be legally put on the road here in the last 10 years, there must be a way. I'm not exactly certain what it is yet. So we're busy pouring through the manuals and the rules and the regulations, and like I say, I'm trying to find the right certifier who will understand what I'm trying to do and how I'm trying to do it, understand a bit about the older cars, be interested in helping, and we'll go from there. I believe anything that's considered unusual, there's a technical committee that meets between the low volume certifier people and NZTA, which is the people who issue the registrations in New Zealand. So what I'm really hoping is, this is very similar to other cars. So there is a replica Bugatti going through at the moment. I think there's a couple of them actually being built. And what I'm hoping is, if it's anything like working in a government department, I know from experience with that, often if you were trying to do something getting it past the IT security people or something like that. If you could say, well, we've done it before like this, and this basically follows the same pattern, they would usually be quite happy to say, yes, we can see this is the same sort of thing. So yes, we have already established that's okay, and yes, you're allowed to do it. I don't know if it works the same for cars or not. You would think so. You would think there'd be something like that there. But this is one of the reasons why it's so important I build this car as accurately as possible, because it does have to be a historic replica. So it's kind of where I'm at. It's a little disappointing now finding that the Austin, which is basically ready to drive, is going to be a more long and convoluted process, and it really kind of saps your enthusiasm, to be honest. And the other thing that's going to slow things down a little bit at the moment is I start a new job tomorrow. I'm going to have to be commuting into the city a bit more as well. So I just won't have quite as much time to work on it. I am still waiting for the remote shifter. That's been sitting there quite a while now. It's still sitting in the UK saying it's ready for export. It just hasn't been exported. So I'm suspecting I won't see that until next year now sometime. I just get worried that it's going to drop off the tracking and just suddenly disappear into nothingness. And I do need, still waiting for the brake parts to come from the register. That's usually pretty quick, but of course being around Christmas everything's going to be slower again. And now I need to do another order to them, I think, for bolts, and I might as well start getting some of the other engine components I know I'm going to need, such as cooling pipes, and I'm not sure what else I need actually. I'll have to look into that. But yeah, at the moment it's just kind of a lot of waiting for little bits and pieces.